Hello, fellow investors, and welcome to another episode of Ritter on Real Estate, where we teach you how to passively invest like a pro. Today, we're talking about a niche that's often misunderstood. It can be mispriced, and in many cases, it can even be mismanaged. That's student housing. So, to break it down today, I've got someone who's an expert in the space. Zach Feldman is a partner at Aptitude Development. It's one of the nation's leading student housing developers and operators. They've got over 5,000 beds and another $250 million under construction currently. Zach leads new development, sourcing, underwriting, entitlements, capital markets, investor relations, a full stack of job description there. And before that, he's launched his own project at Enjoy 77 Holdings, investing in colleges, got 22 assets. And so Zach's got a wealth of experience in student housing. So Zach, welcome to the show today.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so let's start with, a lot of our listeners, because I'm in multifamily on the conventional side, right? We spend a lot of time talking about it. So a lot of familiarity there, but I love digging into different asset classes or different niches every once in a while to give folks a little understanding of what else is out there. So let's start with that, right? So most investors, I think of student housing as multifamily, but I know there's a lot of differences operationally, structurally. So help us understand, what are most investors misunderstanding about student housing?
Yeah. So, again, thanks for having me on. I love the student
Absolutely.
housing space. Being on college campuses is very biased, but it's more fun than being in industrial warehouses, kind of, far from any major city. Everyone's, it seems to be sunny every time you're on a college campus, even when it's cold. But, some of the major differences in the student housing space, you rent by the bed versus by the unit. So if, Kent, Zach, and Jim were best friends freshman year, and we move out of our freshman dorm. Ideally, you move into one of our buildings, which is called the Marshall brand. All of our buildings are bed to bath parity. So if there's 500 bedrooms, there's 500 bathrooms. So Kent, John, and Zach would move into a 3-bedroom unit. You'd have your own, walk-in closet and bathroom, and you'd all share your living room and kitchen. So it's very similar to an apartment, but it's a little bit designed for the actual user experience. And you all sign your own individual lease, which means the strength of the rent roll with the guarantors is very strong. The other part of that is, being adjacent to college campuses, you have a very defined user base, where I think in multifamily it's a little harder to track down demand drivers. What is, wage growth, population growth? Is that here? If I'm a quarter mile down the road, does that make a difference in the multifamily space? Can I be disrupted quite quickly? In the student space, we call them roll out of bed locations. Can you go out on a Thursday night, have a good time, and make your Friday 8 a.m.? Typically you want to be able to hit like a high lofted iron and be able to hit campus. And if you can, a 10 to 15-minute walk, you're usually in a good spot. You
Mm.
try and place yourself towards the bars or large academics, so like the business school, or if it's an engineering college, something like that. It's from kind of site selection is very important. Your lease structure is materially different. I would also say your clientele obviously is different, but from the touch point in the customer service, it's starting to trend more towards almost a hospitality asset versus multifamily. You don't really get as many phone calls or as much headache. If a light is out in a student apartment, sometimes they might call maintenance. They've never had to change their own light bulb. Some of them have never done their own laundry before, right, when they come to college. So in many ways, roommate mediations, you're doing a lot of the kind of grunt work of repairs and maintenance and kind of teaching them those life skills. But from the investor standpoint, the biggest difference from multifamily is how you monetize your rent per foot, right? So in some markets, if you're going to get a 2-bedroom could be 800 square feet and a 3-bedroom could be 1,200 square feet, right? And you're renting by the unit on your chunk rent. Maybe you're getting $2-3 a foot. In the student housing space, your highest and best use for dirt, typically, outside of maybe New York or LA, is student housing. So like Ann Arbor is a good example. They're getting $1,800 a bed on a 4-bed, and that's a 1,200 square foot unit. You're getting $6-7 a foot on rent, right? You're not going to sniff that with a multifamily asset. So you're able to get a much higher yield with what we think are more defensible rent rolls. Your construction cost on a price per foot might be a little bit higher, considering you're having to build all the bathrooms, but high level, your yield should be much, much higher, and you should have a more defensible asset because of the rent roll in the university that is a demand driver.
Yeah, I mean, and those things make a lot of sense. You talked about kind of market selection. Who your audience is, right? You know what's creating demand. It's going to be that university that you said is maybe just what'd you say, high lofty club away. So easily accessible. Talk a little bit about, you mentioned some of the operations like maintenance. Maybe it's a little more intensive. They're maybe a little more needy, the clientele. Talk about that. Like what does it look like to manage a student property today, whether it's I imagine you guys are on the forefront of technology. I imagine that it's just quite a bit different than what you would do in a traditional multifamily property.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of nuance to that, but we jokingly say like internet's more important than water, right? Where
Mm,
like if the Wi-Fi is down or if it isn't at to certain speeds that can do like an iPad, a computer, and gaming and everything in between, like you're just not going to be a competitive asset. So the technology package is very important to us, but backing up even further, in a multifamily building, let's say you're going to deliver, maybe you start leasing 60 days before, right? I don't know, 90 days before, 30 days before, depending on the municipality and the assumption, the assumptions you're going to make in your underwriting and what the market can bear.
mhm,
And you kind of build it and hope people will come, and you'll use traditional listing services. From the operation side, on the student piece of it, you start a full year in advance. So a good example of that is a project we're delivering in Arizona. Is delivering in spring of 26. We started construction spring of 24, but we opened in 1 year after construction started and a full year before occupancy, what we call a leasing office, or in some ways it's comparable to like a condo sales gallery, right? So you'll
mm,
walk in, there'll be music, there'll be kind of a good vibe, and there'll be anywhere from 3 to 6 full-time employees of our building whose only job is to lease that building, and that'll have music and renderings on the wall, and they'll have the floor plans. They'll go out and sponsor bar events or Greek life events. They'll go and kind of what we call like flyer on campus or hand out flyers, raising the awareness and kind of the brand of the building from a year before we open, right? Not only what is the feeling and the vibe when you step in the front door, but how do you build that brand a year ahead of time? The good part about that is if we do our job, come, let's call it July 15th, when some kids start to move back, you have 100% occupancy, right? Maybe you lose a small percentage for no shows, but de minimis, right? Where in multifamily, it might be a year or 2 year of lease up. To date, we've leased on average over 95% of our beds the day our doors open. So our rent roll and our collections start day one of the building being occupied. We have a lot less of that drag over the opening of the building and the student space. So in terms of how you operate it, that's just unique, right? If you're a multifamily person and you're not attuned to that, or maybe you don't budget for it or understand the marketing piece of that, you're screwed, right? Like we're all going to be leased up and no one's moving after August 15th, right? One or
right.
two who they, have an issue with, their boyfriend breaks up or their roommate hates them or some bullshit at the frat house. But like for the most part, you kind of have your rent roll locked in August 15th, and that rolls all the way through the end.
Yeah, what happens if you're under construction, you run into delays and things, and
There's
you deliver
horror
late,
stories. Yeah. I
right?
mean,
You basically miss a year, is that how that works?
so there's horror stories about it all the time, right? Not our
Yeah,
building, thank God. There was one that caught on fire like halfway through construction, and the delivery was a big problem. On our second building, we had some delays with construction, a very short timeline, and we had to put kids in hotels for I think it was the first 2 weeks or 3 weeks of school. So huge burn on us, huge operational headaches, but didn't lose the full year. Used about lose a few weeks of rent. The flip side being is a lot of our personnel and senior leaders were on site throughout that process, speaking with parents, helping them move into the hotel, apologizing, taking the blame. There was no hiding behind kind of a
mm,
mask or a cloak. And I think a lot of parents said, well, listen, if they're here, like they're in good hands, right? This is not a perfect scenario. It's not ideal for what our kids wanted to move into or were excited about. But there was a lot of lessons learned and taking accountability for that. It ended up being a phenomenal success. We ended up selling the building to Syracuse University down the road, and it's now considered part of their on-campus housing. But I would say we certainly adjusted our timelines and some of our construction contracts to account for that. And God willing, we'll never have a delivery that's late even by a day. We typically will even buffer a few months on the front end to account
sure.
for that.
Yeah, I mean, you really have to be thoughtful about when you start your construction project, right?
Yeah.
When you'll deliver. Yeah, to time it up and be thinking a couple years ahead. That's
You can't
interesting.
you can't say stay at home for an extra 30 days or, can I crash on your couch for a month while I just moved to New York, right?
Right.
You're delivering on time or you're screwed.
Yeah.
And, our contracts with our GCs reflect that, but also ensuring like we've punted projects, right? Where we thought, hey, it might be a 18-month build and it's going to be closer to 20 or 22. And we'll push it from a fall start to a spring start and we'll miss a school year, but we're not going to deliver late ever again.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Talk a little bit about what you said. You mentioned, obviously you're pre-leasing, you're starting that a year ahead. And, I'm curious how like what that marketing and sales process looks like because you've obviously got a student who's the one that's actually going to live there, but you've got a parent who's going to sit behind it as a guarantor, right? like, who are you really selling to, and how does that work with, what does the parent wanna see versus the student?
We say you have to sell the beds twice. Sometimes it's 3 or 4 times, right? Because sometimes it's a mom and a dad,
Yeah.
sometimes it's a kid and then the roommate and then their parents, right? But you're selling the kid kind of on the dream, if you will, of the new building and what could be a great living experience, while they get their education. And then, a lot of the things that matter to a kid, such as, we have cold plunges and saunas in many of our buildings now, right? Parents don't give a shit about that. Is it safe? Is it close?
Right.
Is there on-site staff? Things of that nature. And we design kind of for all of that, and we make sure that it's a safe and comfortable place to get educated, but we also want it to be fun for the kids. But I do think part of that is it's not Animal House anymore, right? Like there's cameras everywhere. Like, we still want kids to have fun, but you need to be respectful of the building. And,
Mhm.
the guarantors are certainly on the hook if anything goes wrong. But it's a much different sales process than maybe in the multifamily space because the maybe the lead process isn't as long or difficult. It's a very targeted audience, right? But making sure you're dealing with some of the needs of the student as well as the adult, it just takes a lot of handholding and honestly, it's quite rewarding when you see people go, "I'm really excited for my kid to live here. They had a great experience. Thank you for everything." Those instances are nice, but the process is there's a lot more detail that goes into it.
Yeah, I can imagine, but I'm sure having the parents as guarantors is, good from a risk management standpoint. I mean, what do you usually see as, like, default rates or, bad debt? Does that make it
I,
pretty low? Is it pretty
Yeah, I would say industry-wide, the delinquency is well under 5%, right? There's certain markets that have had rougher years than others, and, certain schools are much better than others, but that's, a fair industry statistic. A lot of people love the investment from an LP standpoint because of the low default rate
Mhm.
and kind of the strength of that rent roll.
I mean, it makes sense. It would make sense, right?
I mean,
So
like, what parent is gonna take a ding on their credit report because their kid forgot to pay, their rent that month? They're just you call them on the 5th or the 10th or the 15th, and, a lot of the emails about, repairs and maintenance or building going down, the parents are on the emails as well. The parent will just call you like, "Why didn't Kent pay?" And I'm like, "I can't answer that." You go, "Great, well, let me know where I should send the money." They're not
yeah.
gonna take, their credit report getting hit and, a lot of the average incomes, we look at thousands of data points before picking a school, right? The median income in some of these
Mhm.
schools from the parents can be hundreds of thousands of dollars, right?
Mm.
If it's a very let's call it, lower median wage school, that might be better from an acquisition standpoint, but it might not be as sufficient for new development where you really need kind of a higher threshold of rent. So kind of picking those markets in the right spots, help protect that rent roll as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and that's a great segue to my next question, which was, how do you select the schools that you build around, right? I mean, is it is it size, geography? Is it, maybe they just won a national championship, like IU happened to, my alma mater? What are you looking for, top 5 things when you guys are looking at places to build?
Yeah, I mean, we look at again these thousands of different metrics. The big kind of like check boxes for the SNP test, if you will, is the enrollment at the school, right? When you underwrite maybe an MSA or some of the employment base, whether you're an office or multi, you're underwriting the university, right? So what's the enrollment? Has it grown? How's the rent growth? What's the dropout rate, right? Is it a lot of 5-year kids? Is that a good or a bad thing? How is the grad versus undergrad split? What's the in-state versus out-of-state? There are a lot of things like that. But I think maybe more specific to student, which helps you make some very informed decisions, is you can very much narrow in on what the net demand is, right? Where in other asset classes, I don't want to say it's impossible, but it's much harder to pinpoint that. Where at IU, if you have I don't know, was there 30 plus thousand kids that go there, right? Maybe there's a
Mhm,
freshman live on requirement, so 5,000 live on campus. Your net demand's 25, right? And then you say 5,000 of them are grad school. I'm making these numbers up, but then you have let's call it a capture market of 20,000. And if there's another 5,000 purpose built beds, well, oh, great. I can go after 15,000 kids, right? That's
mm,
a pretty nice capture rate. And you can do some of the math. I'm like, well, if we're going to build a 500 bed project versus a 1,500 bed project, right? Maybe we're not comfortable delivering that large of a project in that school. But,
mhm,
the flip side is, what's in the pipeline. You can start to factor that in, or 3,000 beds in front of city council that maybe we don't want to go into this market for the next 3 to 4 years as those start to get absorbed. Has the enrollment gone from 50,000 to 35, right? What does that
mhm.
look like? You're really betting on the growth of the school. Like that's your demand driver, that's your clientele. If a school is moving in the wrong direction, you should be very concerned about it. Again, there's nuance, right? Some of the Ivies or more prestigious schools don't want to grow, right? But
Mm.
many times you're just looking at your supply demand fundamentals, and it's probably the only asset class where you can truly pin it down.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think that was a good explanation of it, and in all seriousness, I imagine sports performance, it has to be a big decision in a lot of people's minds on, like, where they go to school, right? And so, like,
You see an
is that something
application
that
pop for
weighs
sure.
in?
Yeah, you see an application pop after national championships or after like large runs. We have a building at Coastal Carolina.
Yeah.
Not the biggest brand name school. I don't know if in kind of as our business has evolved, if we do a school of less than 15, 20,000 kids, but that became a very big national story. Their quarterback was on fire. They had the baby blue, or I guess it's more of a teal field,
Yeah.
and that on ESPN, like, that raised a lot of brand recognition, and you saw applications start to pop right after Alabama has seen large enrollment growth. I can't say it's all because of football, but
Mhm.
you're seeing Georges of the world, these large state institutions with robust athletic programs see big pops in application after the kind of the brand name recognition starts to get out there, right? Say what you want about the academics, but when you're looking at some of these larger state schools, they're not drastically different, right? Beyond on
Mhm.
state lines. So if you have good sports, it becomes a fun place to go to school. You see a lot of them start to reinvest back in their facilities beyond just athletic too, as kind of the alumni base gets more excited. So definitely schools you want to bet on, but again, once you dig into the details, you have to make sure that there's some real juice behind it.
Probably need to see that consistent performance yet or 2, right? So IU, we're still we got 1 in, 16-0. Let's see if we do it again and again, then maybe that's the place to start doubling down on student housing. We'll see.
Yeah, there's a lot of supply coming in, but that's a fun market for sure.
I'm sure. Well, that's awesome. Appreciate the insights there, Zach. Changing subject a little bit to something, that we talked about briefly. You guys have quite a bit under construction right now, about $250 million worth of product, right? And so,
Absolutely.
you hear generally people speaking about real estate right now, and they say, "Oh, ground up development, it's too tough. Rates are high, costs are high. We can't get it done. It doesn't pencil." So I'm curious how you guys have gotten 250 million to pencil. What's the differentiator there, the secret sauce behind that?
Great question. I would tell you that it is much harder, right? I think, when we used to maybe look at 100 deals, you do one or two, that used to be at least 10 that we sounded, were feasible. Maybe we didn't, get the contract, to where it would be with the seller, and there's some disparity there. Or maybe, some of the macros of the school faded off as we were doing our due diligence. But, we used to look at 250 schools across the country that we thought were investable for new development, right? For acquisitions, it's
Mhm.
kind of a different story. There's some phenomenal markets, like an Oklahoma of the world, that don't pencil, right? Whereas now we look at maybe 25 markets, 30 markets, right? So it's a much more of a sniper rifle approach where, some of our wood frame projects that, are a little bit older vintages now, your hard costs for 50, 60,000 a bed, right? Some wood frame product in certain, similar geographies, that the price is double. We look back at some of the GMPs we signed, in 2018, and we're like, we should have built everything, right? We could have retired at this point. The construction cost has gone, really sideways. The flip side is, in the right markets, in the right locations, the rents have kept pace, if not better. I'll give you, the Michigan example I gave earlier. We're working on a few sites there, and we're very excited about that market. When your rents are 5, 6, $7 a foot, it still makes sense, right? And that
Sure.
would be the main differentiator between student. And I think if you go on, studenthousingbusiness.com, or you look at some of the new developments coming in the ground, there's billions of dollars in actively under construction. And there's 10 or 15 operators that do it really well. But we're going after, I would say, more similar markets now, and the land process is definitely more competitive. But it's just much more of a sniper rifle approach. And I would say the other part of it that we feel could be too conservative is location's more important than ever, right? Like, I think
Mm.
some people that might have come into the industry late, or have kind of gotten ahead of their skis in our specific asset class, was they thought, well, listen, maybe I'll be on the west side of campus, even though the bars are on the east side. There's enough demand in the market. Your rents are lagging. You're seeing a tale of two cities,
Yep.
very much depending on where you place your asset. But if you can be in the right location, and you can put in the right, what we call, unit matrix, where it's not too heavy one way versus the other in terms of the density, and then you design it the right way, and you brand it the right way, and you can really operate it in kind of what we consider our standards, you can be very successful. But it's so much so much harder than it used to be. Not to say it was easy, but to go from 250 down to 25 or 30 markets, it just uh, it's a lot more brain damage.
And what's primarily driven the kind of niching down to those 25 from 10 times as many markets you were looking at? Is it just because costs are up and those are the markets that just pencil based on cost, or is it something else?
Yeah, I mean, like a good example is, if you go to a tier one state school versus a tier two, right? And it could be an hour away, like Auburn versus University of Alabama, right?
Mhm.
University of Alabama's gotten much better from the investable side, but still really hard to make work. I think their rents per bed are in the high, eight, 900s to maybe 1,000 or low thousands, depending on the product type. Where Auburn, you're going to be, anywhere from 12 to 1,500 bucks a bed, right? So you're getting a premium, but my GC and my sub base and my materials isn't going to be drastically different from Tuscaloosa to Auburn, right?
Yeah.
One's just a much more investable market right now from the new development side. A lot of that can be done, come down to the municipality. Are they making it more difficult to build? Are they only rezoning certain pockets where you can really get a big moat against new development if you can get the right project in place? Like everything, there's a lot of nuances. Location, location, location all day long is very much relevant in the student space. But the big driver is rents in certain markets haven't kept up with costs, and you're also seeing kind of in a different tangent, if you will, college is becoming more of an AUM business, right? Where like the big are getting bigger and they're
Mm.
doing better and the small schools are not, right? Like listened to something the other day and they were like, you kind of mid-tier private equity firms that haven't returned capital in the last 5 years are kind of fucked. Whereas like
Mhm.
your Blackstones and Brookfields of the world that have the machine, like no one's getting fired for investing in Blackstone. And
Yeah.
that was kind of like the old GE saying and IBM saying.
Right,
It's
right.
not as specific with student, right? But like you're seeing the big schools get better and a lot of your tertiary or even small markets are just non-investable. There's
Mm.
no liquidity on the back end. There's no enrollment growth for rent growth. Like, there's some phenomenal schools that, like, as an individual, I would love to go do a project at some of these 3,000 person, mini Ivies. But like, if you drop 500 beds there, you're done.
Right.
There's not enough demand.
So there's a consolidation happening among, like, where people go to college, it sounds like?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at some of the out of state rates at, Alabama's, UT, the Michigans of the world, right? It used to be they were proper state schools, right? Now they're just incredibly attractive places to go to college no matter where you're from. And
Interesting.
the enrollment growth has absolutely shown that. I mean, I'll give you a
Interesting.
good example. We built a building at the University of Arkansas, awesome asset, 647 beds in between the football and baseball stadium, Chick-fil-A across the street. We just exited last fall, really, really successful product and investment to date. And when we started doing our due diligence and diving into the school, I think the enrollment was in the low 20s, right? And now it's in the low 30s, right? So you're really your demand is increasing by 30% from when we just
Mhm.
started our DD to when we exited the investment. And there's supply coming in and stuff has been built, but I mean that's incredible growth, and a lot of that has been spurred by, I would call it, very strong leaders at the institution. Where if you're with kind of like touching the state, you get in-state tuition. So half the license plates you see in parking lots are from Texas, they're not from Arkansas, right? The
Mm.
kids can't get into UT anymore. Maybe they don't really like the vibe at SMU or whatever it may be. Arkansas is very much like a sister community to, a lot of people that live in Texas. And that is a big reason for their growth, is how the school strategically said, we're just going to get bigger and we're going to build out our programs.
Gotcha. Even willing to take, lower tuition per kid, giving more people broadening what they consider in-state, right? So it sounds like just to grow and scale. Interesting. Well, it's an interesting dynamic, yeah, I wasn't aware of. So, just continuing the conversation around kind of investment and student and, thinking about it from the passive investor standpoint, right? The LPs in these deals and for our listeners that invest. As people are considering, new investor hasn't invested in student, as people are considering an investment, I mean, what are the things they should really be looking at? And on the flip side of the coin, like, what are red flags? Like, what are things that people should stay away from?
Well, I'd say if you're interested in a student, definitely call us. We have a bunch of projects that, we're excited about and we're happy to discuss. If you're an LP looking to get involved, the water's warm. We love what we do. This is kind of what we, eat, and breathe all day long. So,
Mhm.
we're always open to that conversation, even if it's just from an educational standpoint. In terms of red flags, I would say it's not like uniquely different from multifamily. Like, what is the strength of the sponsor? How vetted is the deal? How aggressive are the assumptions? We walk all of our investors through, the OM. If they want to go through the model, it's very detailed. We go through that as well. But if you're looking at another student provider, I would definitely look at the strength of the university. Even, it's kind of like product market team, right? Even if you have the greatest product and the greatest team, if the market's not there, you're swimming upstream the whole time. We could put the best operating team in like the nicest building in the greatest location, but if the school is losing, 3 to 5% of their enrollment every year, there's only so much you can do. So I would definitely, dive into the market specifically and understand the dynamics there. Another big thing is, understanding kind of what the product type is, right? I think a lot of people got lazy, maybe more so in the multifamily space and student, kind of just putting up a lot of cookie cutter 5/2s or 5-story wraps, and there really no brand or product differentiation. We spend a shitload of time, touring buildings, meeting with architects, understanding, you know, really what a 16-year-old today wants.
Right.
Because by the time we deliver a building 2, 3, 4 years from now, depending on the entitlement process and the drawing set, and them kind of getting out of their freshman dorm, like it could be a 14-year-old in certain senses by the time we're like done kind of with our ownership of the asset, right? Is gaming
Yeah.
still going to be important, right? Do they like a big thing we talk about, I'm sure you're talking about it too, is parking. Some schools have like 2-to-1 parking per bed, right? And I'm like, kids don't want a car in certain areas, right? Like they'd rather just, Arizona, there's Waymo everywhere. It's like it's pretty wild what is going on in the world, and it's advancing much faster than the municipality or the regulations are keeping up with. But a big piece
Yeah.
of evaluating is what is the design, where is the spend going? Another thing we look at and we protect our LPs for, is kind of how far along in the deal are, right? I see people trying to raise money kind of for a deal before it's approved or maybe vetted enough, and I think that can cause some complications. We take all risk dollars up front. And then when we get through our municipal approvals and have term sheets and drawings that are pretty progressed with real estimates behind them, we'll start to raise, outside capital for the LP stack. I think if you're, more of a passive investor, you just have to understand where the process of deal is. And the other thing, it's corny as hell, but like we care. I don't like when other people say that to me. I'm like, everyone gives a shit, but like, do they? One of the things we do is when I go tour a site, I'll go to dinner and then at like 9 or 10 o'clock, I'll walk from our site to the library and back. If I don't feel safe walking to our site in the library, from the library, is your son or daughter who's 18 or 19, those are things that we spend a lot of time understanding. The amount of time I've spent in like student centers being like, hey, can I buy you a coffee and ask you about what you do and don't like about your apartment building? It's like awkward as hell, but like you really understand what people want and what they don't. Not every college kid is the same. Every university has a much different clientele. And we spend a lot of time understanding that.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I think you gotta it's interesting, right, about the 14 or 16-year-old and what are they into? It's like I've got, a daughter who's almost 10 and, you start to think about what her interests might be, in the next 8 years and kinda how you build a building to prepare for that. Like, as you look ahead, what are the things that, I guess, like you said, the kids are into that you guys are building in maybe to current projects? And what are you thinking about for projects that, maybe haven't even started yet, right? That might be delivered in 3, 4 years, like you said. Like, what are those things the kids are into?
Yeah, I would say you've seen like an industry kind of trend from what you call like the amenity wars, where there was like lazy rivers and like some buildings had like place where you get your nails done in like a hair salon that like,
Mhm.
listen, it wasn't a great dollar spend in my opinion because, you had to get a lifeguard full time for the lazy river if it's a certain size. And then, your OpEx starts to get dragged drastically,
Yep.
to try and bring someone every week to do nails, and did it becoming like no one would show up, then everyone would show up. And these are some of the things you kind of saw industry wide. And then you look at kind of a holistic approach. We put a ton of focus on health and wellness. We try and have the best gym in every market. We try and have sufficient study space. I wasn't the best student, many, many years ago. The average college student is very focused on their health and wellness, right? And when you say wellness, it's not just like a cold plunge with the sauna that we've put in all of our new buildings, but it's more so like they are studying a lot. They are taking school seriously. They understand it's a competitive world out there much more than it was 20 or 30 years ago. And so you're seeing a big focus kind of on that aspect of it, of how do you provide a great place for them to live and have fun, but also to be successful kind of for the reason they're in school. That again, I think is more something we focus on in a way that we've been successful. Some of the way we're looking at buildings in the future, um, is, I think health and wellness has become table stakes, but a big thing we've started to trend and kind of put a focus on our management is they're becoming less, I would call it operationally like multifamily, and more of the hospitality from the design and touch point. That doesn't mean there's a guy helping you bring your bags in every day, but there is anywhere from, it's called 5 to 8 and full-time staff and part-time staff at all of our buildings. And like the response time to, maintenance requests, is incredibly important, where I think some people in multifamily just are more independent, but what is the smell when you walk in the lobby, right? We've started to look at creating custom scents, the music, and what is the light temperature in the morning versus the afternoon? How are you positioning buildings for sunlight, right? A lot of nuances that you don't really think about, but when someone does them really well at like a nice hotel or a great restaurant, you're like, wow, that hospitality experience was levels above anything I've had before. And it's
Sure.
not necessarily like, again, having someone that's going to come to their door every night and turn down their linens, but more of the aspect of like, how does the user experience evolve when you interact with your surroundings? And that's something that I think is going to become, again, table stakes, but we're putting a lot of emphasis on today.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just a place to live like we think about sometimes on multifamily, like, it's a whole experience, right, is what you're talking about. I mean, it's really high end. And I guess it makes sense with where I mean, when I when I went to IU my senior year, I think I paid 425 to live, 5 guys in a 4-bed house that was, like, half falling over. And,
It's the best.
yeah, it's a little different now if you're paying $1,800 a bed. You know?
And that's a high watermark. That is not what we charge all of our buildings. That is
Yeah,
not, I think, a perfect example, right? But yeah, I think the high end of the market, you can certainly get into the, teens and high teens. Granted,
yeah,
we've built some new buildings that, the blended rent per bed, a little over $1,000.
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, like I joke, I wouldn't want to live in any of our buildings. I love building them, and I think they're a great user experience. But like, I like the freedom of a 5-bedroom, 2-bath with a keg in the living room, and just kind of having that experience with my buddies. The world has changed since then, but there's always going to be a place for that. In the student business, we call it the shadow market, which
Yeah.
is really hard to quantify. But some schools, that's just kind of the ingrained nature of the kids, and it's a great opportunity if they've never seen kind of institutional quality before. But it's not for everyone. It's a certain sect of the market that wants to live in new construction, not so dissimilar to the new condos or new Class A apartments, right? The old Class A becomes Class B, and the old Class C becomes moves further down, and you really have your kind of your trickle down effect of things becoming more affordable due to the new market being raised. But it's not for everyone. I think we provide a great product, and I honestly I do think there's a great value when you think about if you wanted to go rent a 1 bedroom, it's going to be much higher than our, let's call it 4 bedroom with your buddies, because you have your own
Mhm.
private space where it still feels like a 1 bedroom in terms of bathroom, closet. They come fully furnished, right? So you're showing up with your book bag and like your linens, and that's it. And so we do think there's a good value to that. But there certainly is a market for everything in these different college towns.
Yeah, Zach, I think it's been really interesting, for me personally to learn about student housing, think about this idea of, like, really this experience you're trying to create and kinda how it sounds like competitive, it's gotten as you're differentiating. I mean, you have to be so in tune with the differences of tastes that happens every couple of years, right? Because people are, coming in and out, and there's big differences between a 14-year-old and 18-year-old and what they're gonna be into. So you guys have to stay so in tune with what's happening, like, so relevant. So I think it's really fascinating on how you guys are keeping up with that. Appreciate the conversation today. I mean, I think it really helped me reframe student housing and really understand, there can be a lot of value there from the rents you can get to the guarantees from the parents that make, the default rates low. If you nail it right, it sounds like you've got a full place for a full year versus having to worry about leases turning over every month. So there's definitely some good things to think about in student housing and for folks to consider as adding a part of their portfolio. So appreciate you coming on today and enlightening us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. This was fun.
Yeah, if folks wanna learn more about what you guys are doing, how can they connect with you?
Yeah, you can go to aptitudere.com. That's our firm website. Or if you want to reach out to me directly, my email is zf@aptitudere.com. I'm sure you can put it in the show notes, but I'm happy to
Yeah.
chat. I genuinely love what I do. Everyone in our office, well, is loves being on site, loves kind of understanding the different markets and how we provide, for our residents and provide for our LPs. So, don't be afraid to reach out with any dumb questions. It's genuinely something we enjoy every single day.
Well, I appreciate that, Zach, and yeah, we'll make sure it's all in the show notes so folks can click and get your email or check out your guys' website, and again, thanks for coming on and sharing all your knowledge with us today, and you have a great rest of the day, man.